Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to talk about Pharma's first quarter financial results. Now that the big biopharmas have reported their first quarter updates, we here at Scrip thought it would be a good opportunity to reflect on where the industry is at and what might be in store for 2019. I'm Jessica Merrill, an editor at Scrip in the Pink Sheet, and I've been covering the pharmaceutical industry for about 17 years. I focus a lot on our commercial coverage, so topics like financials, drug launches, market access, and drug pricing. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Mandy Jackson and Kevin Grogan, and we're based around a wide range of geographies, with some of us just starting our day and some ending it. So I'm going to hand off to Mandy to introduce herself.
Thanks. I'm Mandy Jackson. I'm the managing editor of U.S. Commercial News for Scrip and the Pink Sheet, and I've been covering the industry for nearly a decade. I also write the Finance Watch column and oversee emerging company profiles and report on everything from business strategy, financing and deals, and clinical trial results to market intelligence and pricing and reimbursement. So I'll hand it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Mandy. Yes, I'm Kevin Grogan. I'm based in sunny Manchester today, which is nice. I'm the managing editor Europe Commercial for Scrip. And like my esteemed colleagues, I sort of been covering the industry for a long time, about 20 years. Write about all aspects of commercial, regulatory, R&D, pretty much everything. Big pharma, small pharma, big biotechs, etc. So, yes. So back to Jess.
Okay, so we're going to be reflecting on the quarterly results, how some new drug launches are tracking, talking about things like generics and biosimilars and drug pricing, and touch on other catalysts and updates that came out of the first quarter reporting season. We'll be presenting for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time to take questions. So please, there should be a box under the presentation where you can type in a question, and at the end we'll do our best to try and answer those. And then also just note that this presentation is going to be available afterwards along with the audio recording, so that will be available to you. Okay, so I'm going to kick things off, and I'll be talking just first about some overall financial themes. So generally, 2019 is poised to be a somewhat challenging year for the sector. Some high-profile drugs are going off patent, and there are some potentially big biosimilar launches. And there's the big drug pricing headwind, particularly in the U.S., where there's still a lot of uncertainty about what policies could be coming. While some big revenue generators are maturing, new drugs aren't making up the gap yet. So drug makers have been relying on steady double-digit price increases to fill that gap over the last decade, but now they're having to scale those back under public pressure. As a result, most of the big drug companies are guiding investors to expect growth to come from volume, not price this year. Some drug companies like Pfizer, J&J, AbbVie, Amgen, and Gilead have forecast flat or even declining revenues in 2019. That said, just to note, J&J's Pharma unit is outperforming its device and consumer healthcare segments with 4.1% growth in the first quarter. AstraZeneca, Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb, Novartis, and Roche are companies forecasting single-digit growth, and AstraZeneca is guiding high single-digit revenue growth and an even higher rate of operating profit growth. For the most part, drug companies met or slightly exceeded guidance in the first quarter, which is to be expected. Mylan is one company that surprised investors with negative sales, down 7% to $2.5 billion and below analyst consensus estimates, though earnings were in line. So I'm going to stop here for now and hand over to Kevin, who's going to highlight one geographic area in the quarter, which was China.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Yes, and China has obviously been in the news rather a lot, and not just for trade war with the US. Big Pharma spoke a lot about their activities in emerging markets, and China dominated a lot of the calls that were held for the first quarter. If we look at the slide here, we've got AstraZeneca. I'm just going to start with the European companies first. AstraZeneca having a very strong quarter in China, with sales up 28% to 1.24 billion. Big rises there, particularly for Tagrisso, their oncology treatment, and Farxiga for diabetes. Sanofi also did pretty well. As did Novartis. China is selling very well. Entresto, the heart drug, heart failure treatment, had what their CEO called the best launch for a primary care drug in China since 1999. And it's not just limited to the European companies. We can see that, again, Merck had very strong growth in China, up 67%, with Keytruda selling particularly well. And Pfizer as well, with some older treatments, certainly Lipitor, Norvasc and Celebrex doing very well there. And yes, as I say, China did dominate a lot of the calls from comments by CEOs. I want to start first with Bayer and their pharma chief, Stefan Ulrich, who spent a lot of time talking about China. And one of the striking things about it as well was that Xarelto selling particularly well for them, with sales doubling in China to 75 million euros. Help for being, because it's on China's national drug reimbursement list. Also, which was quite surprising, I thought, was that drugs like Nexavar and Stivarga, which seemed to slow down a bit, certainly in Western markets, were absolutely soaring in China. Nexavar was up 11.4% to 184 million euros. That's 20% more than consensus forecasts. While Stivarga, again, shot up at nearly 35% to 97 million. Again, a lot more than analysts had predicted, about 25% more. And he made some very interesting comments as well, saying, this is no longer an emerging market, it has already emerged. Though he set a target of 3 billion euro sales in China by 2022 and said it won't be a walk in the park, but the country is increasingly open to new innovative products, which again was the point that Pascal Soriot AstraZeneca said as well, that China is facilitating access to new innovative medicines, as I mentioned before with Tagrisso and Farxiga, which he said, quite frankly, not long ago, nobody would have thought would be reimbursed. And again, the same comments from Severin Schwan at Roche, talking about, using words like truly extraordinary, seeing the growth that was going on. Ken Frazier as well, Merck, saying that we only scratched the surface in terms of the opportunity there. And these are comments that are coming out from all the companies, really. One of the interesting things is that, if you can get onto the Chinese national drug reimbursement list with an innovative drug, it seems that there is a lot of scope to grow there in those markets. And even though it's getting a lot more difficult for multinational companies to sell their generics there, because now in a lot of cities in China they have contracts are going to Chinese generic drug makers. There's still money to be made, and I noticed that this morning German Merck, as they announced their results, said that one of the drugs that is doing very well for them still is a glucophage, which is as old as the wall of China itself almost, and is still selling incredibly well there. So there's definitely a lot of scope to continue, even though there'll be some pricing pressures. But in terms of accepting innovative treatments, Q1 calls were very positive. So that's it on China for the moment, and I'm just going to pass over now to GS.
Right. So just to touch on some of the new launches, which are so critical to driving growth as big blockbuster franchises mature or face generics for the first time. In 2019, drugs like Pfizer's Lyrica, GSK's Advair, AbbVie's Humira in Europe, Amgen's Sensipar are all facing generic or biosimilar competition, and there's the potential that Roche could be seeing some biosimilar competition to its big blockbuster franchises in the U.S. also. So there have been some notable launches like Roche's Ocrevus for multiple sclerosis, which has been one of the best launches of all time, and GSK's shingles vaccine, Shingrix. The industry is also seeing slower launch trajectories, partly due to market access restrictions and a lot of competition. So in addition to Shingrix and Ocrevus, drugs that launched in the last 2 years or so that are tracking well commercially include Sanofi Regeneron's Dupixent, Gilead's HIV combination pill Biktarvy, Vertex's cystic fibrosis drug Symdeko, and I also would just highlight Novartis's Lutathera, which doesn't have a huge amount of sales here, but it is approved for rare cancer indication for certain digestive tract cancers. and it's also a radiopharmaceutical with a high burden of administration. And in that regard, it's doing quite well, and Novartis has talked a lot about expanding in radiopharmaceuticals, so it's something to watch. On the other hand, some drugs that were meant to fill the gap just haven't gotten their legs. So the PCSK9 inhibitors, of course, which everyone has been talking about, Sanofi Regeneron's Praluent and Amgen's Repatha, which were meant to be blockbusters, haven't made a lot of impact. And on top of it, Praluent sales declined in the U.S. in the first quarter on all of this pricing pressure and reducing the price. The CAR-T drugs, Novartis's Kymriah and Gilead's Yescarta, have gotten off to a slow start. And then these two CDK4/6 inhibitors, Lilly's Verzenio and Novartis's Kisqali, really have not been able to make a lot of headway against Pfizer's market-leading Ibrance. So just as a comparison, while those two drugs generated around $100 million in the first quarter, Ibrance generated $1.1 billion in the first quarter. One category that's really interesting to watch is the CGRPs for migraine. So that's the three drugs that launched all around the same time last year: Amgen, Novartis's Aimovig, Teva's Ajovy, and Lilly's Emgality. And this is a big blockbuster opportunity, but three launches at the same time has really intensified the competitive dynamics, and there have been some market access issues as well. So we're going to drill down a little bit more to talk about that category, which is very interesting. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention two other drugs that I think are sort of notable. Pfizer's Eucrisa for atopic dermatitis. That's a drug that launched in late 2016 and doesn't get a lot of attention for Pfizer for probably a pretty good reason. It generated only $22 million in the first quarter. But I just think it's worth remembering they acquired the product with the acquisition of Antares for $5.2 billion. And at the time, they said they expected it to bring in $2 billion in peak sales. So they have a long way to go to reach that. And then another one that is interesting is AbbVie's Orilissa for endometriosis pain. And AbbVie is tracking at a run rate, they said, of about $60 million for this product. This is a potentially big market, and AbbVie had big prospects for elagolix, and they're actually developing it for uterine fibroids, bleeding with uterine fibroids. So that's, another big opportunity. That's a part of it. But uptake could be limited by the cost and side effects since it's associated with decreases in bone mineral density. And AbbVie talked in their call about some challenges needing to build the market here and educate physicians since this is the first drug in a long time. And they said they're going to be investing in a new DTC ad campaign. So also just to note, this has been so far a really interesting year in terms of some of the drugs that have been approved so far. And these are things to watch for the second half of the year and into 2020. There's been these interesting drugs for depression that were approved. Novartis's Mayzent for multiple sclerosis, Amgen's Evenity for osteoporosis, and then AbbVie has a new drug for plaque psoriasis that they're hoping can fill some of the gap from Humira. And now we're going to be really interested in seeing what happens with Novartis's gene therapy, Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy, and also what sort of impact that has on Biogen's Spinraza. With that, I think I'm going to hand over to Mandy. She's going to talk more about the CGRPs, which she's been covering a lot.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. The CGRP inhibitors for migraine prevention have been interesting to watch. They're biologics, of course, launching in a market with a lot of generics. And this seems to be a market where Amgen may have learned from its experience with PCSK9 inhibitors for high cholesterol, where biologics, again, were launched into a market with a lot of generics and low-cost drugs. The pricing for Aimovig, which launched first under their partnership with Novartis, came in at the lower end of what people were expecting, showing that perhaps Amgen learned from the Repatha experience and the initial pretty high price for that drug, which limited sales quite a bit. First quarter sales for this class, the CGRP inhibitors, were still pretty low, $59 million for Aimovig, $20 million for Teva's Ajovy, and $14.9 million for Lilly's Emgality. The the sales to date have been really limited by free drugs that all of the companies are providing to get patients on treatment while they're still negotiating reimbursement contracts. And even for drug that's now being paid for, there's pretty heavy discounting, 40% or more on these drugs, so that they can all get on formulary. There's been a lot of excitement about it in the community, though. Migraine doctors that treat a lot of patients have been waiting for something new, and these drugs all seem to work pretty well for a lot of patients, but they all work very similarly, so it's difficult for any of the companies to distinguish themselves. Competition is coming, of course. We've got an IV option for migraine prevention and a couple of oral drugs from Allergan and Biohaven for acute migraine, so treating a headache when it comes on. In terms of reimbursement, though, I'm going to ask Kevin to say a few words about reimbursement in the EU, which also has been quite challenging.
Thanks, Mandy. Yes, it's been extremely challenging, which is for listeners who know much about NICE will know that's the norm nowadays. But Novartis was quite shocked by the response from NICE. I mean, Aimovig was approved back in July last year in Europe, but Novartis got the knockback from NICE, who said it wasn't convinced that it was more effective than Botox. Because Botox, it costs in the UK about $1,400 a year. That's excluding any sort of patient access schemes. And price-wise, they're saying that Aimovig has a list price of about $5,000. And Novartis is obviously not very happy with this, pointing out that Botox involves something like 40 injections to the face, which isn't particularly pleasant, of course. It was interesting to see how this was NICE saying no, which covers England and Wales, whereas Scotland last month did back it, albeit though they did claim that there were some weaknesses in Novartis's health economics evidence. So it's again classic example that certainly in Europe it really is getting very tough to get a premium price for a premium product. And as Mandy was saying, certainly here as well, patient groups have been and physicians have been crying out for something, a more effective treatment. But the knockback for Aimovig by NICE really is an excellent example of how pharmaceutical companies are being frustrated by the agency, the watchdog agency here, in their attempts to get to market. And in the UK, it's clear that we are lagging well behind comparator countries like France and Germany in terms of getting access to these new medicines. And so this is a big problem for obviously all these companies with their innovative migraine treatments. So it's a problem, certainly, as is reflected in the poor sales. Okay. Thanks, Mandy.
Thanks, Kevin. I was going to also talk about another pretty interesting and competitive market. Psoriasis for the last couple of years has been tough for all the companies involved, and we have a new launch now coming from AbbVie, which will have the third interleukin-23 inhibitor with Skyrizi, formerly risankizumab. They are feeling pretty good about their launch performance. They think that they've got an inroad into the market with Humira having psoriasis as one of its approved indications. And it sounds like they're going to be pretty aggressive in terms of getting on formulary. They think that they will ramp up and have coverage in the U.S. much faster than other drugs that have been launched in the last couple of years in this market. But they have a lot to make up for the top seller of the new biologics for psoriasis include Novartis's Cosentyx, which by far had the most sales, $791 million in the first quarter, which was up 36% from the year before. that's an interleukin-17 inhibitor. Lilly's IL-17 inhibitor, Taltz, grew 72% year over year in the first quarter to $253 million. And then Johnson & Johnson's IL-23 inhibitor, approved in 2017, jumped from $72 million in the first quarter of last year to $217 million in the first quarter this year. And that's pretty impressive, but they're still way behind Cosentyx at nearly a quarter of sales for Novartis's drug. So it's pretty competitive. The companies during the first quarter that already have been on the market for a while with psoriasis drugs were saying that they feel confident about being able to defend their products against Skyrizi as a new market entrant because they've already been competing for a while and know how to position their products. Of course, AbbVie is projecting confidence as well. So that'll continue to be an interesting category to watch, and one that could be impacted by biosimilars. In the U.S., not yet, not so much because Humira's biosimilars won't launch until 2023, but they are in the market now in Europe. So I'll ask Kevin to talk a little bit about the biosimilar impact on the psoriasis market in the EU, and he has some more comments too, more generally on biosimilars.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mandy. Yes, I mean, we've had biosimilars in Europe for quite a while now, so it can tend to get a little bit boring, the discussion, but the first quarter has changed that a bit for us, really, I think, in that it's been very interesting to see that AbbVie has suffered its first ever fall in Humira sales. With the international sales, obviously outside the US, that is, falling by nearly 28%. A bit of a whopper, really. And so we're actually seeing the effects of it now on the biggest selling drug in the world. And in the first quarter, Biogen were particularly vocal about how well it's been going for them. That with their revenues of biosimilars has gone up a lot. And their version of Humira, Imraldi, has got off to an excellent start here in Europe. And it would appear that it is the market-leading Humira biosimilar in Europe. As Biogen said on their call for the quarter, that in Germany, for example, which is the largest anti-TNF market in Europe, they believe that Humira biosimilars have already captured approximately 35% market share. And Imraldi, i.e. Biogen's biosimilar, has got 40% of that. Sort of very impressive growth. And in terms of pricing, I mean, that's been the interesting thing, that when a lot of the anti-TNF biosimilars came out first, you could see massive discounts being offered in certain countries of, in Norway, for example, it's like 70%, 80%, 90% in some cases. And I think what will be interesting to see how the Humira biosimilars stack up in Europe is to look at, again, the UK example. And it was interesting that NHS England, rather than just going for lowest price, they sort of implemented a strategy that's quite interesting. It's on two real objectives of sort of plurality and best price. And while they recognise that need a competitive system here, it's not a race to the bottom as such, where the lowest price manufacturer takes everything. And it's been interesting to see the benefits actually to the system here as well, to the NHS itself, which said that had predicted last year when Humira went off patent in Europe, which was, it was about October time last year. And it was interesting that NHS England said that hospitals could save up to 150 million per year by switching to biosimilars. And now they're saying that the way it's gone, the way the contracts have been working, that they've now upped that forecast around 300 million, which is, it seems to be working well for the companies and for the health service as well, in that they now expect to save around 300 million. So it's been a very interesting time. Roche will moving on to Roche now has been hit harder with Rituxan and Herceptin sales going down. That's a concern for them, but they knew it was coming and have prepared fairly well. Obviously, things will get interesting when we start seeing biosimilars in the US, and that has been one of the reasons why a couple of companies, particularly in Germany, like Merck, German Merck, obviously, and Boehringer Ingelheim, have decided that maybe biosimilars is not the great market it was once touted to be. Boehringer, for example, I was speaking with their head of Pharma recently, who was saying that, and they were one of the leading forces in biosimilars, say, over about a decade ago, have now decided to pull everything rather than a Humira version in the US, because the margins will be a bit tight, and they've decided that in terms of how they want the business to progress, it will be more on innovation, though they still think it's a good market. But I think that, again, the most interesting thing will be is when we see biosimilars hitting the US in a big way. And I think that Jess was going to say something on that as well.
Yeah, this is an area I've been looking at a lot, also along with some of the complex generic launches like Advair, and it remains a big question mark how this is going to play out in the U.S. There's a lot of variation in how the biosimilars are performing. So for Amgen, biosimilars had a big impact on its Filgrastim brands, that's Neupogen and Neulasta, mainly the short-acting Neupogen, which now only has a 30% share of the market. So that's a drug that Amgen points to a lot as an example of the biosimilar market working. But long-acting Neulasta is holding up well under new biosimilar competition. It had a 90% share of the market, Amgen reported in the first quarter call. And a lot of that is the new on-body, on-pro device they developed, which accounts for a 60% share of the long-acting market. So that was sort of a life cycle management strategy on their part. Neulasta sales were down 12%, however, due to the pricing, and Neupogen was down 29%. And J&J's also been able to hold on to a similarly strong market share for Remicade in the infliximab market, despite two biosimilar competitors, although they've taken a hit on price. So again, sort of similar situation where sales declined more than 20% in the quarter, but the product held a 92% share of the infliximab market. And so it's just sort of raising questions about the viability in the U.S. market right now with some of the incentives. If a company can just lower the price of their drug, a brand name company lowers the price of the drug and gets the market access. So AbbVie, as Kevin mentioned, is facing the first biosimilar competition to Humira in Europe, but they have patent protection most likely until 2023 under their settlement agreements in the U.S. And then there's Roche, which is a bit of a question mark in the U.S. And we could see the first Herceptin, Rituxan, and possibly Avastin biosimilars in the U.S. in the second half of the year. So the company signed a bunch of patent settlement agreements with biosimilar manufacturers on these drugs, and they've not disclosed the exact timing, but in their 2018 annual report, Roche did say it expects biosimilars of all three to launch in the U.S. in 2019. So this market is still something to be watching closely, and it's been pretty interesting too with Mylan having developed the first generic Advair, the first generic version of Copaxone 40 milligrams, which is the preferred formula, and the first generic biosimilar version of Neulasta, still finding that those products aren't making up for the base generics business, which is declining, and some of the problems that they faced. And I think some of those products seem to be maxing out around a 30% market share. Anyway, so I'm going to turn over to Mandy, who's just going to touch on business development.
Yeah, thank you. The companies have been spending a lot of time, their calls lately talking about plans to expand their pipeline via deals, and it seemed that companies were backing off a little bit during the first quarter calls, not wanting to do very many large deals, and focusing even more than they have been recently on smaller bolt-on transactions. Pfizer said it's focused on building out its earlier stage pipeline, and Merck is cautious about doing deals because biotech company values are rising, although lately values have slipped. Amgen, similarly, the CEO has said quite often that in the past year or so that they're interested in deals of all sizes, but commented that they will be a disciplined buyer, sort of signaling that perhaps that they won't be doing any large deals. Bristol Myers, of course, has a lot of money tied up right now in buying Celgene, so it'll be focused on small deals for a while too. Lilly was a little less specific about the size of deals that they'll do, but in the past they've said that they are not really interested in doing necessarily large transformative deals. Although they were quite active in the first quarter, including their $8 billion acquisition of Loxo Oncology to access targeted cancer drugs. Biogen is a company that's under pressure to do deals because their aducanumab for Alzheimer's has been essentially completely discontinued, and it needs to refill its pipeline, and probably in all stages of development at this point. They were not really very specific about what they'll buy, and even kind of noted that they would look in adjacent areas, not necessarily strictly neuroscience, which was kind of interesting. There's a little bit of investor discontent over some transactions. Buyer investors are not very happy about the last year's big acquisition of Monsanto, of course, not in the pharma area, but it's a transaction that's proving to be quite problematic with ongoing litigation over safety issues with the weed killer products like Roundup. Big settlements starting to come through. It's pretty clear that they'll be spending several $1 billion on those lawsuits. There was, of course, an activist investor, a couple of activist investors trying to end the $76 billion acquisition of Celgene by Bristol Myers, but in the end, shareholders in April voted to approve the transaction. So that's moving forward, of course, and Bristol Myers spent a lot of its call talking about how they'll integrate the two companies together. There are a few deals that seem to be kind of hanging in the balance now. Now that aducanumab has failed, it'll be interesting to see if Biogen will continue to partner with Eisai, but they didn't really say anything in the call about whether or not they'll continue to be partnered with Eisai. They have two other sort of amyloid targeting drugs that are in later stages of development right now. Amgen and Novartis are suing each other in relation to their agreement for neuroscience drugs, most notably, of course, the CGRP inhibitor Aimovig, and Amgen is suing because it wants out of the agreement since Novartis' Sandoz division is manufacturing a competing CGRP inhibitor, Alder Biopharmaceuticals eptinezumab, and Novartis is suing to keep Amgen from getting out of the deal. Neither company really said much about that during their call since it's ongoing litigation. And finally, one deal that's kind of hanging in the balance is Lilly and Pfizer's partnership for the development of tanezumab, which has been in phase 3 for osteoarthritis pain and chronic low back pain. But a recent long-term study showed that rapidly progressing osteoarthritis is still a pretty big issue, which could, in fact, derail the drug. But neither company really said anything in the first quarter about where that partnership and where that drug is headed. They're still trying to decide, I guess. So I guess now we'll take some questions. And keeping with the business development theme, we have a question about gene therapy deals and the interest there. Jessica, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so gene therapy was a big area of interest in the quarter. Pfizer bought Vive, a French gene therapy company. Well, actually, they bought a stake and an option to buy the company for $51 million upfront, and they're getting a candidate there for a rare disease. Wilson's disease, and then obviously Roche and the Spark is a big deal for $4.8 billion that has been extended again today. So we'll see what happens there. And then Biogen bought Nightstar and getting ophthalmology candidates in a deal, and I guess it was around $900 million in cash for that deal. So that's going to continue to be obviously a very big area. I know Pfizer's CEO mentioned in the conference call where he was talking about business development and being really interested in moving from products that bring in revenues to products that build a pipeline, that gene therapy is an area that they're still very interested in. I talked to Biogen at the JP Morgan conference. They had talked about, their interest in buying in gene therapy. So I think this is an area we'll continue to see a lot of business development. I was actually just at the Bluebird investor meeting last week and talked with their CEO and asked him about the company, being able to retain its independence. And he was saying how they're just keeping their head down and focusing on the things that they can control and moving the pipeline along, and that they're also very expensive and complicated. So that's that. Let's see. What other questions are we getting? Oh, there's a question on Novartis buying Xiidra, the eye drug that was owned by Shire, and whether there'll be more product rather than company acquisitions. Does anyone want to? Kevin, do you want to?
Yes, I can do that. I was sort of listening to them, and when that came out, I think it was last Friday or something, and I nearly fell off my chair. It was, I kind of forgotten about this product, and we all knew that Takeda were going to sell the Xiidra for dry eye. And when the figure was announced, I think the Novartis is paying wait, I have to check that. It's more than $3 billion up front to buy it, which was quite astounding, considering Shire got hold of it for $160 million just about 5 or 6 years ago. But it was interesting talking to the Novartis Pharma boss about it, Paul Hudson, who's saying that, this is actually a very good deal. And when he was sort of asked as to why he particularly thinks it's a good deal, it's because, it's a product that's already been launched, that's been on the market for a couple of years. It seems that Takeda and Shire, as they were working out their deal to merge, that perhaps maybe the onus wasn't really on promoting Xiidra an awful lot. That wasn't really a priority for them. And he really thinks there's a great chance of making, he called it it's a de-risked asset, really. It's in an area that they know, in Novartis ophthalmology. And I think there's going to be a lot of other companies going to be doing this type of thing as well, rather than splashing the big bucks on a bet. The figure surprised me a bit, but a lot. But if you can get hold of a drug that's approved, that has excellent safety, and in the case of Xiidra, it's got a unique label because it's for both the signs and symptoms of dry eye. This is an excellent opportunity. And, on all these calls, everybody's, the company, the CEO's always asked about what their M&A strategy is, and they always go, yeah, we're doing this, we're looking at everything. But they are always looking at a bolt-on. And if you can spend $5-6 billion on a drug that's approved, that nowadays looks like, even though the figures might sound vast, it looks like good business. So, I think there'll be a lot more of that, of products being bought rather than companies.
Well, also, Kevin, I don't think a lot of people realize that even though Novartis markets Lucentis outside the U.S., Roche actually markets it in the U.S. under a partnership agreement. So it also gives them an opportunity to build up a U.S. presence in ophthalmology ahead of this approval of their VEGF inhibitor next generation product, which I can never pronounce, broccolizumab or something like that.
Yes.
So I think that's another sort of big factor in the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it'll be interesting to see how that develops, because Novartis is saying this is going to be a blockbuster. and the sales at the moment are about, I think, 50 million, and they're saying we can get it up to 1.6 billion. So this will be a very interesting case to watch as well.
We have a question about the outlook for drug pricing in the U.S., which I could just talk about briefly. There really wasn't a lot of big updates on the issue of drug pricing during the first quarter calls, and I think partly that's just the level of uncertainty with what policies are actually going to be coming. There's not too much that can be said until there's more defined policies, and also so many of the CEOs had been to the Senate in that big drug pricing hearing, which actually I was able to attend, and sort of laid out what they think are, should be the path forward, which included changing the rebate system and more focus on value-based reimbursement agreements. So I do think the comments were generally pretty limited, and if someone did get asked about it, the answer could really only be, well, it's kind of wait and see. But the industry really does support some kind of rebate reform, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how all this materializes over the rest of the year. And then I think in general, to expect that the drug price increases on the mature marketed portfolio is going to continue to be under pressure. And a lot of companies have committed to making, one-time price increases or keeping their price increases to a certain threshold, generally under 10%, and then trying to come out with these more transparency around the net price increases. And in a lot of cases, the net prices are declining even. So I think that's sort of what we can expect to continue to see. Let's see. We have a question about NASH drug approvals and initial sales forecast. It's not an area that I am as familiar with. I don't know if either one of you is interested in touching it. We have a resident expert about that. Okay, yeah, maybe Mandy.
Yeah, unfortunately, you don't have our NASH expert on this webinar, and that's Joe Haas, who has taken the lead on our NASH coverage, but I've written about it a bit too. I'm not exactly sure what the forecasts are right now, but there's a lot of hope that these will be billion-dollar drugs given the size of the market. NASH is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is a disease that is essentially largely tied to obesity, and obesity rates are, of course, rising. So they're talking about millions of patients globally. The lead drug, of course, is intercepts beta-cholic acid. Ocaliva is what it's marketed as for its initial indication in primary biliary cirrhosis. That seems to be in the lead. It still has problems with high rates of pruritus or itching, severe itching, but it's a drug that doctors are already familiar with anyway, so it probably will do reasonably well in the initial NASH launch. They've got their data reported. They're working on their filing. But of course, it's a competitive space. Gilead's lead drug has not done well in phase 3. And then beyond that, we have a lot of smaller companies as well. Genset, which went public this year, and I think its IPO has done pretty well, is one of the companies that's expected to report phase 3 results for its lead drug. So that will be quite interesting to see. I wish I had more specific figures for you on sales forecast, but it's a bit of a tough one, I think, too, because it's like hepatitis C, where it's a big market, but it's hard to predict whether or not patients will actually get treatment because they're not always symptomatic with this disease. So yeah, that's, I guess, all I can say about NASH right now. We also have a question about which launches we're excited about this year, and I'll of course note the CGRP inhibitors again. It'll be interesting to see how they can get over that hump of all the free drug that's in the market, and Amgen expects pricing and reimbursement issues to stabilize this year, so hopefully they'll start gaining traction. Lilly has said that it's starting to move into the lead, so we'll see in the second quarter if that turns out to be the case. Right now, Aimovig has about a 40% market share, I think, and the rest is pretty evenly split. Another one that'll be interesting for Amgen is their new osteoporosis drug, Evenity, which they had a hard time getting approval for. It's finally now on the market, and the pricing looked pretty competitive. They are feeling pretty confident about that because they're already so well established in the osteoporosis market with Prolia. So they definitely have the benefit of having a lot of experience. We'll see how well it sells. Jessica or Kevin, would you like to?
Yeah, I would definitely say Novartis's Zolgensma, still to be approved, but it should be upcoming in May. And the first gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, the second gene therapy approved in the U.S., but it would be interesting, especially coming from the big pharma like Novartis, how they're going to set the stage with pricing. And I'm going to be really interested in hearing more about all of that, annuity payment models and interesting reimbursement proposals that they might be coming up with. And it's also going to be interesting to see how that launch impacts Biogen's sales of Spinraza, which is approved for SMA and has been really successful and a big growth driver for them. So I would say that, Kevin?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that as well, damn it. But yes, no, it's a massive one. I think another one I'm very interested in is going to see how the launch of Mayzent goes from Novartis. Again, talking about Novartis. This is the first oral therapy approved for progressive multiple sclerosis, secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And I think that the multiple sclerosis market has been really interesting. And then, as you spoke about it before, I think, Jess, about Ocrevus has really sort of blown the market away with this the best ever launch in the US. But Novartis does fancy its chances of competing with their treatment, which is it's a follow-on from Gilenya. And they know how to market MS drugs. Gilenya, until I think this quarter, actually, was probably the best-selling drug that Novartis had. And now it's been overtaken by Cosentyx. But it will be interesting to see how they position Mayzent and how they can compete. Price-wise, I think will it be with pricing? I think it's going to be $90,000. It'll just be interesting to see how they do it. I'm very interested in seeing how they will go about it. And again, like you were saying with the Zolgensma, it's going to be a very exciting time around Novartis way as to how they do their launches.
I'd also just say AbbVie's Skyrizi. I'm really interested to see if they're able to leverage Humira to gain market access with Skyrizi, and that could be a real leg up, especially with bundling contracts or exclusive contracting that we see in the market. So I think that will be something to keep an eye on as well. And it looks like we have some just questions again about will the slides be available after and will the recording be available after. And yes, those will both be available after. I believe you should just have access to them, but I don't know the details on that. And I think if anyone else has a question, now is the time. I think we can. Otherwise, we have no more questions in the queue, and I think we would wrap up a little bit early. Anyone have anything else, Mandy, Kevin? Anything you want to add?
No, just that, again, it's been a very interesting quarter. But I just wanted to bring some breaking news to you that, I was talking about Humira and adalimumab and how Boehringer Ingelheim were only going to sell their product in the US. Well, they have apparently just agreed, as we speak, to settle with AbbVie. So that'll be something for us all to look at now as we write our stories for tomorrow.
All right.
So.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And I think with that, we will be closing the webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for calling in.